Well, hello there. Welcome. My name's Chris Dabbs, and I am joined to talk about something quite interesting, I think. It's something that we're going to be looking at across the world more and more. The impact of, I'll tell you what, don't let me tell you. Let's introduce who we've got here. Let me get rid of this music, and then let's introduce Sophie. Would you like to say hello?
Yeah, morning. I am, my name is Sophie, and I'm an MA student at the Uni of Brighton studying journalism. I do have some experience of living over in Australia. I lived there for about 9 years when I was younger in my childhood. And something that's very close to me and something that I care a great deal about is the welfare of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia. I feel that when I was living there, I saw quite a lot of destabilisation and, lots of separation between the way new Australians or white Australians are treated and treated separately from Indigenous Australians. And I think it's important to recognise the traditional custodians of Australia and pay our respects to sovereign peoples of that land.
Well, that's true, isn't it? And I guess sovereign people of every land, not just Australia, but obviously we're just talking about Australians and New Zealand people at the moment. And do you think that what you've just mentioned is peculiar specifically to the white population of Australia? Because it's quite a mixed bag over there nowadays, isn't it?
It is certainly. I mean, Australia is quite well known for its sort of cosmopolitan cities around the coastline, for sure. But it is difficult to have total representation in legislative bodies and systems of governance in Australia, particularly for people of Indigenous descent, because there has been so much fragmentation in their communities and sort of distance between people who once belonged to the same nations and clans and have had to sort of find their way back into homelands where they can reconnect with the land due to sort of dispossession of the last few hundred years.
Yes, yeah. Well, we could talk about this for ages. All these questions are coming up. Now, remember, I'm not an expert in this, so I'm just here really to find out. It's fascinating stuff. So, Geoff, introduce yourself as well, because we've been talking, leaving you there.
Yeah, I'm Geoff. I'm a freelance journalist and also a student at Brighton University doing the MA in journalism.
Excellent. See, and so we're all here basically doing the same thing. And what's your specialty within this subject?
Yeah, I just have an interest in a lot of nutritional science surrounding and the impact of how we're eating today has had on sort of Indigenous cultures. I've also got an interest in human rights issues, and obviously there are a lot of issues concerning Aboriginal people and Maoris in New Zealand and how they're treated. So yeah, that's my area of interest.
Right. So I see how this conversation is going to go, because we're talking about the human rights of the Aboriginal peoples. You're talking about the nutrition side of that. And it's going to be fascinating when we get to that part, I think, because, just as a bit of a taster, literally, we're talking about how that diets have changed because of, I guess the way that cultures have been changed over the last few hundred years after colonization, I imagine. And, this whole colonization subject is interesting and not specific to Australia, but, we've had it in Canada, you've had it in America, what's now America, and South America, all over the world after the Europeans went for that. So, okay, where shall we start? Should we start with the human rights aspect of things then? How go for some history, explain really what's happened since colonial times, since Captain Cook, I guess, came along to Australia, was it? So, Sophie, is that something you'd like to pick up on?
Yes, certainly. First, I should say, as a disclaimer, it's obviously very difficult to speak on behalf of a hugely diverse peoples of Australia who, yes. We are very much separated from at present, being in the UK for starters. But no, it does not. There are hundreds and hundreds of Indigenous nations across Australia who have very particular systems of kinship and always have. The most difficult part of the sort of colonisation of Australia by European invaders is that 65,000 years of Indigenous history and traditional custodianship of the land sort of managed to break apart very complex systems of kinship, like hundreds and hundreds of smaller nations inside Australia that all had very particular familial networks. It was an incredibly difficult thing for all Indigenous peoples to manage and survive through. And in essence, the way it's treated in discourse now is to be sort of considered a genocide of a race of peoples who, I mean, have still so much history and so much connection to the land, and very particular ways of life which were completely attempted to be completely extinguished by colonists. And so being able to reconnect those networks and to be able to settle in new homelands where Indigenous peoples can re-establish and continue their ongoing connection with their lands is what is fundamentally important today. And that is why it is so crucial to be able to celebrate and establish the achievements of the Indigenous population of Australia in helping their culture survive and continue and flourish today.
And it's really difficult to do that with any Indigenous culture that's suffered, and I use that word, suffered under colonization, I think. I mean, I've had some experience of this in Canada, and you see how it's worked over there in terms of there's segregation, that sort of going onto reservations and living in certain parts of cities, and it still happens. I mean, in Australia, is it different to that? Is there more of an integration between the original Australian people, if you like, and colonists or descendants thereof?
From my personal experience, and I know that doesn't account for much because I'm one little person in a sea of many, but my personal experience was that there is quite a separation between the way Indigenous people are treated in Australia, the way the systems of governance in Australia treat Indigenous people, without sort of respecting the traditional structures of clans and families in producing legislation and trying to integrate populations around the country. I mean, of course, the cities of Australia are very much focused on the coastline, but rural Australia is enormous, and often funding for homelands doesn't trickle through as it should. And as a result of that, lots of the rural areas of Australia tend to be quite deprived, in comparison to what you see around the coast, for sure.
Yes, exactly. Okay, that's interesting. But is there some sort of how are the governments dealing with this? Is there some sort of I hesitate to say it. It's probably an outdated term, but some sort of positive move towards integrating people in a sort of a fairer way?
I think moves are being made towards representation in the largest federal and state government bodies more than anything. I mean, Ken Wyatt, who's the Minister for Indigenous Australians, is trying to fight for an office for Indigenous policy evaluation at the moment, so that Australia can take into account the way that Indigenous populations want to self-govern, but also how they should be receiving things that are centrally distributed. So there's still a lot of deprivation in education, schools for young people in those areas. And I think the idea really is to make sure that integration is about treating everybody equally and making sure that opportunity is not taken away from those who otherwise achieve extremely well. Incredible amounts of business success in the Indigenous population at the moment is a symptom of just hopefully of progress and, equality moving forward, social and political equality.
Well, that's good that it's moving forward. I think that this is, quite an interesting thing to bring you in on, Geoff, because if we're talking about helping Aboriginal people to sort of, not integrate's the wrong word, isn't it? But to actually just be part of society at large, rather than integrating into another society. If you look at your specialty, Geoff, which is about the diet and the effect of a Western diet on Aboriginal people. I mean, start from the beginning with this, because this is something that I think that a lot of people have got no idea about. But those people don't eat the same way as, if you like, other Australians, do they? I mean, go on, I'm making a hash of it. You go for it.
Yeah. There's an inextricable link between human rights and health. And one aspect that is rarely spoken about is the impact that Western diets have had on the native cultures in Australia and New Zealand. I mean, at one time, the New Zealand Maori were considered one of the healthiest populations in the world. But now they're considered actually one of the most unhealthy.
Okay, now see, that's quite a statement, isn't it, to say that a whole people are unhealthy. Well, why is that? I mean, is there a specific scientific reason we can start with in this discussion for that?
Yeah, I mean, the dramatic change in the health of the Aboriginal people and also the Maori seems to have began after they started moving away from their sort of indigenous diet. You know, their diet, was essentially devoid of the grains that we so commonly consume today, and they were essentially modern hunter-gatherers. But during the period in which non-native populations came in to their countries, they started to move away from their traditional diet. Essentially, the people arriving considered the way they lived and how they ate very primitive. And so those traditions that they've had have gradually sort of drifted away, and they've sort of now eat the same food as everyone else.
Which is interesting, isn't it? Because, the way that you say it eating in a primitive way, and again, I'm not trying to stereotype, Bush Tucker, as it were, but I mean, there have been there's an extensive research on eating wild, foraging, the centuries, thousands of years that the people actually lived on that. And of course, they wouldn't have seen things like perhaps wheat or corn even until the colonists arrived. So the impact of them being given that kind of food, which means that they don't have to forage as much as their ancestors did, is that what you're talking about? Is that part of how things have changed for them?
Yeah, I think that is exactly part of it. I mean, the latest nutritional science that I've seen basically says up until the agricultural revolution, which was about 12,000 years ago, humans were essentially hunter-gatherers. We lived off a mixture of fat and protein and had only a small amount of carbohydrates in our diet. So how we actually eat today has completely turned this on its head. Scientists say we're not metabolically designed to eat large amount of carbohydrates, which is why it's suggested so many Western countries have been swamped with sort of the obesity and type 2 diabetes epidemic. And Maoris and Aboriginal people seem to have been disproportionately affected by this as well.
All right. Do we know why that is? Is it just because they've got access to cheaper carbohydrate-based food?
It's almost like industrialized.
Yes.
A food system. We get 90% of our food from a supermarket. We're not generally going out and catching fresh food that's been roaming the fields. And
no, exactly. So too many carbohydrates, too many cookies and biscuits. Certainly in my case anyway, what can you say? So Sophie, I mean, how does that work out in terms of the human rights side of things for these cultures? Because surely that has an impact on everything, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And I think it's a good indication of a long history of breaking up things that drew Indigenous clans and families together. But together, you decide how to share resources. So if you, for example, if you have a totem that is the grey kangaroo, somebody's moiety means that they are responsible for hunting the grey kangaroo, and the other person's moiety means that they're responsible for conserving the habitat of the grey kangaroo and making sure that they survive. So this idea of tying into land in all respects is a huge part of Indigenous life, and it's something that has been very much taken away, but still preserved in many respects.
And that's fascinating. Sorry to interrupt. I mean, that's fascinating because that's what, basically we need. And that's what we're trying to do now as a Western civilization is to conserve the environment, isn't it? Which is what they were obviously having to do because resources were much scarcer in those days, weren't they? So how does this, for the Australian and New Zealand governments, do you know how they're actually trying to push forward a better way of healthy eating? Geoff, is there something, or Sophie, is there something that they can look at?
In fact, I wouldn't know actually. I should know, but I would have thought that in essence it's a little bit about centralized governance. So of course, if you did have liaisons with different nations of Australia, different Aboriginal nations of Australia, then you would be able to establish a, a structure that would work for everybody in terms of sustainable living and living in accordance with
the land, basically, I think. Yes, or in accordance with nature.
With nature, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk very briefly about, well, no, it doesn't have to be briefly, of course, but let's talk about the Naidoc week, which is something that's happening between the 8th and 15th of November over in Australia. Is it just Australia, or is it, well, who'd like to tell me about that then anyway? Go for it, Sophie. So what's Naidoc? That's celebration of Indigenous cultures, I understand.
It is indeed. It's a week not only for the celebration of achievements and progress in Indigenous society in Australia, but it's also about paying your respect to the long history and ongoing history of interventions in Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal lifestyles, and how things move ahead to rectify what's been done in that country. The things that were taken away, but are also being re-established and achieved by incredible work across Indigenous nations in Australia.
That sounds wonderful. So, in other words, it's the whole country getting together to celebrate the achievements and to re-identify, I guess, exactly the contribution that the Aboriginal people can give.
Absolutely. I mean, it in its essence, it is about understanding that Indigenous Australia has always been there for 65,000 years of history of traditional custodianship, being the sovereign people, the first nation of that country, and recognizing the fact that everything is built on top of something that is continuous and eternal. And that is the history, that is Indigenous history. And it is something that needs to be not only established in a week, in a year, but to be a constant. It is Australian history, actually, and the things that we are taught as kids in the mainstream sort of education system as being Australian history are in fact aspects of new Australian history, as they call it, or European Australia, when actually this is the real Australia, and it's something that unfortunately is hardly seen by the rest of the world, or certainly by a lot of new Australia.
Well, yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's get back to the nutrition side of things as well, because hopefully there's some work being done on that. But one of the things that amazes me is that if you look at British health and you look at how, back in time to the Victorian period, really, we were healthier, which I find hard to believe. Is that right, Geoff?
Yeah, it doesn't seem fathomable, really, but actually it's recognised in nutritional science that the golden era of British health was actually in the mid-Victorian period, which is
incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, you would have thought with the disease and the malnutrition that wasn't the case. But sorry, I interrupted. Tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking here 1850 to 1880, basically at a time when the diet was sort of comparable with what we would describe as modern sort of low carbohydrate diet or paleo diet, and life expectancy was equal to what it is today, and if not better in some cases, which does sound strange, but this is what the science has shown, and basically that started to change, ironically, when white flour, sort of tinned meat, sugar, canned fruit, this sort of thing started arriving, and that was around 1875, and within 8 years of that, we then started to experience problems of undernutrition, which is a deficiency of calories, and height deficiencies also emerged.
Yes, that's been in the news recently, hasn't it? About in the UK, where there are discrepancies in the height of children, and they're obviously saying that this is down to, not obviously, but they're saying this is down to nutrition. How about health over in Australia and with the Aboriginal people, Sophie? Is that something that carries through as well, this conversation we're having?
It does, in fact. I mean, at the moment, it's difficult to understand where the patterns are emerging here, because obviously there are elements of, as Geoff says, dietary instability that cause long-term health problems. But in our current situation during the COVID epidemic, it's only about 0.5% of infections related to COVID-19 that are occurring across Indigenous communities. And I think that is partly due to their community-led pandemic response. So it's been funded. There's lots of sort of resilience projects funded by the National Indigenous Australians Agency, which has allowed sort of elderly people, elderly survivors of the stolen generations, to connect with each other and spread information in a sort of a bottom-up approach that I think has helped protect them from the pandemic in quite a big way. And that would explain the figures that we're seeing at the moment, which is a very, very low infection rate there. And I heard an interview with Dr. Finlay, who is the Vice President of the Health Association of Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health, I think. But she did say that Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do know how to be responsible for their own health, and they should be contributing to help make the decisions on their own behalf. Well, should be making those decisions because there is a huge capability there of protection and healing. And I mean, it's something that's been like that for thousands of years. I mean, the Ngangari are traditional healers across Central Australia, and that's something that works in harmony with medicine all over the country. I mean, it's very important to have that community-led response. I think it does protect people's health.
It's interesting because, of course, if you're saying there's such a low instance of COVID-19 presently within that community, is that because Australia is quite sparsely populated, do you think? And obviously those guys are living away from the main urban conurbations where perhaps there's a higher risk of infection? Or is it purely that they're actually managing it better?
I think it may be more the latter than the former, to be honest, because obviously we do talk about homelands as being rural areas a lot of the time, which is true because that is how the government has divided up land. But truthfully, I mean, we must also think about Indigenous nations and clans who live in urban centres and who are part of urban society. Those figures do stretch across that area as well. And I think it is a lot to do with communication, more so perhaps than locale, although there are obviously benefits of living on the outskirts of towns. And I mean, to be fair, if I were back in Oz right now, I would be worried about living right in the centre of Sydney. I certainly would, and I would much rather be out somewhere like Dubbo, sort of with a lot of space around me.
I think we've got the same issue everywhere, though, haven't we? Really, everywhere. I think that where we are at the moment on the south coast of the UK, I think there's a bit of a flight from London out to the country areas surrounding London, really, to try and do the same thing. Well, there we go. Okay, well, this is fascinating stuff. I mean, at the end of the day, Geoff, what do you think about that? Do you think that there's a way that the nutrition can help keep us fitter? There must be a way that to be able to combat COVID-19 and how that affects us, or is our current diet just really not a good idea in terms of being able to thwart the infection?
Yeah, I think diet can play a really big role in helping tackle COVID-19, actually. I think how we're eating at the moment is not optimal for health. I think we can see that around the world in how, we're having to cope with the sort of epidemic of diabetes and sort of obesity in all of the Western world, almost, really. And I think if this movement about going back to a more ancestral way of eating, there are scientists saying that this is the way to go. And if you look at the countries which have sort of had the most number of cases of COVID, it's the UK and it's America, where the problems of obesity and diabetes are particularly rife. So I think we really there needs to be more research into this area, and I don't know if governments are actually paying attention to what is out there and this science, because it doesn't seem to get mentioned in the mainstream media or among the elected officials. But they really need to look at this, because there's a growing body of work going on that's been going on for the past 2 decades showing this. But yes, it's left to small groups of people, to promote it on social media. And really, I think the governments and the people in power need to look at it, because that could be a very, not an easy way, but if we can make some simple changes to our diets and we should surely be trying everything we can to prevent the spread of COVID. Well, and that would save the NHS, potentially millions of pounds. And in fact, sorry, Chris, just to say as well, that, some of the scientists that I've been, reading about that they are warning, ironically, before COVID, that the health services around the world would collapse because of the obesity and diabetes epidemic, unless we take, a major action, which is going to mean needing to change the dietary guidelines that we all operate off and have a relook at them and bring them up to date. I mean, these are things that were brought in the 80s, that is decades old. There is new science. Science doesn't stand still. It continually evolves. And the science has evolved, but the governments and the policies haven't seemed to have caught up with that. And I think I'm hoping the people in power are starting to look at this, because, what we've seen in COVID is what they were suggesting would happen naturally anyway if we don't improve our health and nutrition, and it's happening during COVID. So if we still have COVID and that as well, then what situation is the world going to be in?
Yeah, sure. So this is where it ties in nicely with our conversation with Sophie in terms of the nutrition side of things, where you're an advocate for a sort of a paleo kind of diet. So explain that to people, because I quite like the idea of that, because I could chase after a mammoth with a club or something. Couldn't I go and get my dinner? Is that what that kind of thing is about?
It's more, it's going back to how we ate as sort of ancestrally, and trying to tap into our metabolic health,
Exactly. No, exactly. Which is, of course, what the Aboriginal peoples have been doing, and everything's changed for them, what with colonization. So it ties well together. So give a quick example of how people are saying, or the research is showing, that our bodies actually work, and what's the best kind of food for us. And then we can talk, Sophie, about whether or not the Aboriginal people are still using that kind of diet, or are they moving towards it or not. So Geoff, tell us, so where can I get my club, and where can I find the mammoths?
Yeah, I mean, basically how we're eating at the moment, the guidelines are from the governments around the world to eat a high carbohydrate diet, your pastas, your rice, potatoes, all of that. The research that I've read is suggesting that is actually causing the health problems of that we're seeing at the moment, the diabetes and the obesity. And basically that is because carbohydrates spike your blood glucose level, and then basically the pancreas is forced to secrete insulin as a counteract that. And then basically, because we're eating this diet all alive, after sort of a couple of decades, the body becomes immune to all the insulin that the pancreas is producing to counteract all the sugar and from these refined carbs that we're eating. So basically, we then become susceptible to these conditions. And so basically, the ancestral eating is sort of trying to remove those carbs. So you would basically, you're looking at eating fresh fish. You're trying to eat sort of grass-fed meat, going back to the traditional ways that how we used to sort of regenerative farming, exactly, if I can say it,
yes.
Which is, grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and other animal meat, letting them roam in their natural habitats, not the sort of factory farming that we sort of seem to have got ourselves into at the moment.
Well, that's another point, okay, because of course food is big business. And so we could get into politics here as to where, we're being churned, or all this food is being churned out, and we're being advertised to in order to actually become consumers of these things, irrespective of whether or not we believe that it's a healthy option or not. It's just a simpler option. And we're told that a cereal is a good thing to eat at breakfast, when perhaps it isn't. So how's that working out over in Australia and New Zealand for the Aboriginal people? I mean, obviously they also follow the advertising, I guess, but to a greater or lesser extent, do you think, Sophie? Do they stay with their own ancestral eating, as Geoff's mentioned?
I mean, I should preface by saying, obviously, I'm not the right person to speak on behalf of any communities in Australia at the moment. But
nor would you claim to.
Nor would I ever claim to. But what I would say is this is a really interesting argument in respect of natural resources in places like Australia, because I do agree with promoting sustainable foods. Absolutely, natural resources that grow incredibly well in countries like Australia. There is a movement oftentimes this does leak into the city's urban centres, sort of central business districts. There's a kind of movement to pick up on superfoods, things that they're treated sort of as undiscovered gems. And
Yes.
what happens is they become like a staple of contemporary cooking and contemporary experimentation. And I would always err on the side of caution here, because my feeling is this can sometimes be over-cultivated. So I'm thinking of things like the Kakadu plum. I mean, if suddenly the world decides that there's a massively global demand for Kakadu plums, the cultivation of that crop is going to be enormous.
Yes.
And therefore, I don't know if it is sustainable anymore. But we can still appreciate, obviously, the sort of incredible nutritional value of things that have grown, been used as human food and sustenance for thousands and thousands of years. But just as in any nation, the urban centres and the rural parts of a country always receive different ends of food production. I mean, for starters, it depends on your economic category, because the cheapest foods available to all of us are highly processed foods.
Yes.
And it would be absolutely tragic if this is like the staple foods that once provided a huge amount of nutrition to particular people then become hugely inflated and no longer available because they are treated as a kind of novelty. And I think a lot of sort of bush-themed restaurants run by non-Indigenous people have started to make use of Australian native plants and crops that are obviously very beneficial for your health.
Well, I've got to stop you there, Sophie. Hang on, I've got to stop you because hang on. Whoa, that's really interesting. So, bush-themed restaurants where you've got to explain exactly what's on the menu at a bush-themed restaurant. What's the ethos behind it? So it sounds fascinating and perfect.
Yes. Well, to be honest, I'm not an expert, as I always say about everything. So I'm not really an expert on anything. But I did read a little bit about a new trend in sort of using what people do consider very Australian ingredients. I mean, we've always had kangaroo steaks on the market, even if they haven't always been that fashionable. But we're talking about using sort of wattle and lemon myrtle is a flavour that has always been on the sort of high end of artisan food production, and now that is absolutely ubiquitous across Australia. That's a native crop to Australia that has quite a fragrant smell, a nice perfume to it. And these things are being used in experimental cooking, I think, all over. We're quite well off areas of Australia now. It's quite trendy, I think.
That sounds interesting, though. To actually be able to celebrate is probably a bit of a strong term, but to enjoy that sort of that diet or that cookery would be fantastic. What do you think about that, Geoff? I mean, is that something that you'd like to see, say, over here in the UK? More sort of paleo-based restaurant menus.
I would love to see that.
Yeah, I bet you would. Yeah, exactly.
There are some producers, companies running sort of keto food, keto diet food, paleo food as like delivery services. But yeah, if we could actually really get back to this sort of ancestral form of eating, the sort of proper free range, grass-fed, grass-finished, meat,
yes,
freshly caught fish, trying to get away from all the chemicals and the.
So another interesting point, which obviously follows on from the keto and paleo diets, is about the nutritional information that we all hold. So in other words, what we believe to be healthy. So we believe that grains, nuts, fish, all of those things are healthy. And we've already discussed that industrialized food production isn't necessarily healthy, and that we could be just being advertised to in order to be consumers of those things. So one of the things that amazes me right now is, and I'd like to discuss this with you guys who are far more expert on it than I am, how does the impact of a family not passing on good nutritional information or guidance affect children, affect older people within a family unit? Do you understand what I mean? Does it make sense? So in other words, me as a parent, I understand that eating whatever is very healthy. So I encourage my children to also eat that. But if that hasn't happened because the menu, if you like, menu choices have changed over the years, what sort of impact has that had for the Aboriginal people, Sophie? I mean, is this something that worries them or worries anybody?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would definitely say, obviously, as you say, Chris, information about nutrition is passed on through the family. And if you think about the past 100 years of Indigenous history, there have been many, many times, like especially between 1910 and mid 60s, when the legal forces there took part in a stolen generations regime, where they were effectively excurging Indigenous culture from the Indigenous children of Australia.
Yes.
And what that served to do was to splinter family structures, to splinter families and clans who would ordinarily each have a very specialized understanding of how to work the land and how to engage with their own food sourcing. And I think that kind of disintegration of the family unit, forcibly done so, obviously, it's not as though anybody had a choice in this situation, apart from the authorities who chose to destroy family lineages. That is where the natural passing of information about nutrition should be from. And of course, where there are little pockets and that has not been able to be continued, I'm sure there must have been so much lost during that time about traditional eating, how to effectively keep yourself healthy based on stories that have been passed down for thousands of generations.
No, exactly. Passing on again. I go back to the old. Is it a trope of bush tucker? About yes, eat this, eat that. That's safe. That isn't safe. And for Aboriginal peoples, of course, that's how they existed for, as you say, tens of thousands of years. And I wonder, Geoff. I mean, in a westernized society or any sort of non-Aboriginal people society, is this something that is being discussed at the moment? The idea of not having the nutritional knowledge passed down from generation to generation, or even within a single household.
So difficult for consumers today and families. They're trying to do the best to bring up their children and obviously for them to be as healthy as possible. And people generally are following the dietary guidelines. The problem is we're following the guidelines to a T, but we're actually getting sicker than we were a couple of decades ago. So
that's not good news.
No. And I think it's very, there's so much information out there, for every study that comes out that's, bananas are good for you, there'll be another one that bananas are bad for you. And I think this has been going on for such a long period of time. I think people are really confused. There's so many mixed messages.
Well, exactly. And I think there's also an issue where research is sponsored by corporations.
Well, that's the key factor. Listen, scientific research, as people are probably now discovering due to COVID, is really expensive. What you need, the gold standard is a randomized control trial. It needs to be peer reviewed. It's, there's all these processes that go. This costs millions of pounds. And I think that's part of the issue. It's very difficult to get funding for nutritional science. So who steps in? The food companies. And it's maybe not out of a sense of, trying to be deliberately manipulative, but the science, nutritional science ends up pairing with these companies purely for financial, reasons to get the report done. And sometimes the lines are obviously being blurred and being crossed.
So, which is obviously a frightening thought to think that the human race is continuing in that way without being able to pass things down. So, okay, I think that now we need to be wrapping everything up, guys. It's been fantastic. It's been really, really super, super interesting. But let's talk just briefly again about Naidoc Week. So it's a celebration, as we mentioned earlier on. What can we expect over the next few weeks or the next few days rather, because we're nearly towards the end of it, aren't we, when we're recording this? What can we expect to see? Is there a particular large event in Australia or New Zealand that we can look forward to?
Yeah, well, Naidoc Week, it runs between the 8th and 15th of November this year. It was actually moved from July, where it usually is, because of the coronavirus, obviously, restrictions on social contact. But what usually happens is a lot of sort of outdoor festivities and community events to celebrate not only the history and progress of Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders, but also to sort of pay respects to the elders of clans and families and to understand the sort of, the unending presence of, the original Australia in the society that we've all, worked and lived in today. And it is about also appreciating how much work needs to be done to remedy the social inequalities and sort of the disintegration of social coherence that's been done to Indigenous populations in Australia. Naidoc Week is a place where these discussions can take place, and where a lot of people are supposed to be getting involved, obviously, in understanding what Australia stands for. Not only New Australia and having Australia Day, which is extremely controversial to this day, and to understand why those things are that need to be discussed still. And I mean, actually, in Parliament this week in Australia, there was a vote on whether to fly the Indigenous flag in Australian Parliament to celebrate Naidoc Week and to raise awareness to the aims of the program this year, and that was voted down in the House, unfortunately, which seems a little bit strange when you think about what it stands for. But this year's theme of Naidoc Week always was and always will be, which I think is a really nice phrase that it just illustrates the continuation of history that is the essence of Indigenous culture itself. I mean, the dream time has always been happening and is always still happening. Continuity is the key here, and I think that's something that Naidoc Week is seeking to celebrate this week. So it's a really important time for progress.
All right, so that sounds interesting. And Geoff, you got something to say about that?
Yeah, I just think nutritionally, we can learn a lot from the Aboriginal and Maori people in terms of how they used to eat, and I think there's a danger from what we've talked about in this podcast, in terms of the marginalization of those communities, that all that amazing knowledge that they had of, how to interact with the land and the respect they treated the land with, and how they were able, they were hunter-gatherers, which, may not go down well with some people today with the rise of the vegan diet, but they did it in a way of great respect, and they, that they would catch an animal and they would eat it nose to tail.
Yeah, exactly. No waste. I think this is the point, isn't it? Yes.
And not like, there's a lot of criticism, that how we eat at the moment in terms of, there is an environmental element to this, and that is we at the moment, the sort of pace of everyday life, we get 90% of our food from the supermarket, and we buy the same piece of meat each week, whereas in those native cultures and indigenous cultures, they would eat the whole animal. So it's obviously better for the environment the way they used to do things, and I think there's a danger that we could lose that knowledge if we we should actually be going to them and asking them to teach us what they know and trying to get back to that, in my view.
Oh, exactly. I know. I mean, I'm fortunate after this conversation, for my dinner tonight, I think fresh fish is a good idea. So I know there's a few fishmongers, so I'm going to swing by them. Hopefully they're open at this time of day, though. That's the only issue. It's the convenience, isn't it? This is the problem. All food now is just convenient and unhealthy, and this is where our conversation has kind of been going. So fantastic. It's been fascinating. I've learnt lots, so now I know I need to eat fish, so that's good. Now I also know about the plight of Aboriginal peoples in Australia and New Zealand and all around, and I think that it's an interesting thing that it's a conversation that we need to continue. So Sophie, how can people get in contact with you specifically to talk about this? And Geoff, I'll ask you the same thing. What are your social media details, all that sort of good stuff?
Well, incredibly, I'm a little bit of an antique.
She's a dinosaur. She doesn't.
Yes, I am. Online, I lurk and I don't talk, which is my whole selling point. I'm not sure how long that's going to go on, but yeah, you could definitely drop me an email, my university email. My contact details are on the Overtime webpage where we upload our podcasts. So yeah, I would really like to be more involved in the conversation. Obviously, there always feels like there's a little bit of a distance between our discourses between the UK and Australia. But I do have a huge personal interest in what goes down there, and I would love to talk more about it and be educated myself.
Exactly. I think that's the thing, isn't it? We can't profess to be experts, but we can certainly profess to be, hungry to learn, I think is the thing. So Geoff, what about you? Come on, you're the social media expert. Give out some details of your bits and pieces, please.
Yeah, I think the TikTok account is still in planning, but yeah, you can find me at Keto Crusades, which is all one word.
And keto is spelt how?
Keto.
So So at Keto Crusades, yeah?
Yep, on Twitter. And that's my main platform at the moment.
Excellent. Okay, so everyone, so thank you very much for tuning in. Is there anything else that we need to discuss before we wrap this up?
I think you've done it all, Chris.
Yes.
I think you've led us incredibly well. You've shepherded our flock.
Yeah, that's all right then, as long as I have. Okay, well, in that case then, guys, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope that you enjoy this podcast and are ready for many more to come. We've had some interesting conversations today about, a couple of different subjects, and we've got some food for thought for future podcasts as well. But obviously, give old Keto Crusader a message to suggest any other topics that you'd like us to have a chat about. Thanks for tuning in, and Sophie, say goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you so much, Chris.
And Geoff?
Thanks very much for listening, and thanks very much, Chris.
Oh, you don't need to thank me. It's the listeners that have to put up with me being an idiot on here.
So I'll do that again. Thanks very much for listening. Hopefully people can get something out of that, and we're always looking for feedback. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you for listening, and thank you, Chris. As a final word today, we acknowledge and pay respect to all traditional custodians of the land of Australia on which we have lived and worked. We pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who continue the cultural, spiritual and educational practices of the sovereign peoples of Australia.